If you feel like we could start, Laura, if we can start recording, please keep in mind that we are going to record this webinar as part of DT4 Regions, a series of webinars. Okay, good. So, Ot, are we ready?
Yes, we are ready.
Good. So, hello, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this new webinar on DT4 Regions, Digital Transformation for Regions, the European project. DT4 Regions is a European parliamentary preparatory action supported by with European funds that is looking at understanding how the digital transformations will affect our lives, particularly in our public sector. So in a series of webinars that we started months ago, we are going to follow today with this data spaces for digital transition, enabling data creation, access, and valorization for EU regions. We know this is a hot topic, one of the most relevant potential topics that we are going to discuss in the following months and years. And first of all, let me please present myself. Let me introduce myself. My name is Fernando Vilariño. I'm Associate Director at the Computer Vision Center and Associate Professor at Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona in Catalonia, Spain. I am a teacher in machine learning, robotics, and open innovation. For the part of machine learning, this is the artificial intelligence that is particularly tackling images and videos. So we teach our computers to see in the same way as human beings can see. And regarding open innovation, I'm developing the innovation subjects in the degree of smart cities in Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. I had the pleasure and honor of being the former ENoLL president and member of his executive board. So as you can see, we can speak a bit about technology. We are going to speak also about innovation. I'm very much interested in the social impact of artificial intelligence and the development of the role of living labs or regulatory learning tools, and I'm working together with the European Commission in order to develop this concept. So this is the framework in which we are going to have our webinar today. And the idea is just to create an entry point for data spaces in order to create a mutual learning community for European public servants and artificial intelligence and big data. This is the core objective of the DT4 regions, to try to develop this community of mutual learning with a platform that allows for this to happen. So this will be definitely integrated into the Living-in.eu agreement. This is a political declaration that aims at building the European way for digital transformation for more than 300 million of Europeans. And with that, we're going to try to understand how to integrate interoperable solutions in the smart cities of the future, but not only the cities, also in the communities. So that is the point of DT4 regions, to try and to feed this Living-in.eu with capacity building and skills in order to tackle the digital transformation. For that reason, today we're going to talk about data spaces. Data spaces is a general concept that has been narrowed down during the last years, and eventually it has to do not only with data, but with a lot of things that enables data to have value. For that reason, in the perspective of the common European data space approach, and we have today with us a number of experts that are going to be able to develop this view, we're going to talk about definitely data, a rich pool of data with a varying degree of accessibility. Also, how we can make this data not only diverse, but also to allow for the flow of this data, meaning the exchange of this data from hands to hands, from place to place, in the different sectors as well. Also, we have to take into account issues associated with legislation and the regulatory framework. But not only that, also to identify a technological framework and governance model, a new governance model of distributed governance model for this data access and manipulation. So here we have the chance to apply this approach for data spaces, which is definitely transversal to different verticals. And these verticals act as sectors in which eventual data spaces are going to be developed. For health, for industry and manufacture, for agriculture, we will have a number of examples, particularly on that, finance, also mobility, the Green Deal, energy, public administration in general, and also skills development. There are several projects related to skills, to data spaces for skills that we will have the chance to mention today too. For that, finally, we need technical tools for data pooling and sharing. We have to understand the standards and the interoperability, which is the technical semantics about that, and also the sectorial data governance, how to write down the contracts, how to create licenses if the available licenses are not enough, right access, etc. And also the developing of the IT capacity. This is not only storing the data, but also the possibility of processing this data as fast as possible. So this provides us with a general picture about what we could think of a data space. And there is a number of dimensions for those who are entering, who are having this entry point to that space, that probably would make sense to develop. And for that, we are very, very lucky now that we are having one of the documents that will allow us to start in this topic, particularly generated in the context of the Data Spaces Support Center. We will listen a lot about it today as well. We have today the interim version for December 2022, very recent, the starter kit for data space designers. You can have access to that in the link or in the QR as well. This will be a starting document that allows us to have, let's say, the minimum skills in order to speak in the same language we want to discuss, or we're going to discuss about data spaces. And what are we going to discuss today, or at least from a general and more specific perspective when we are tackling particular examples of data spaces? First of all, there is value in the data. And this value will be associated to the development of these business models and the different creation of value. So the key question here is, how does the data space create this value? Who creates it? Who are the actors that are developing this value from the data, and for whom the target of this data? When we are talking about that, we're talking about the possibility of creating new business models, new models that allow us to develop different companies in sectors that were not present before, or at least that didn't have the chance to access that data or to use that data in order to generate richness. What are the individuals and collaborative business models? What are the incentives for the actors in the data space? And when we talk about actors, about stakeholders, probably we're talking about the public administration, but also we are talking about probably the academia, and we will have an example of that today. We're talking also about the companies, definitely, and we're going to talk about also the citizens organized in different organizations or as individuals. So all these questions will have to be related in what is definitely one of the challenges that we are facing today, which is the definition of a governance model. So the definition of new data spaces is strictly associated with the creation of understanding new models for governance. But all this has to work. So there is a functionality needed in order for data space to be successful. And from that perspective, we know to understand which are the services that are associated to these data spaces. What are the technical needs that we are having to develop? Probably we're having to create new technical approaches in order to develop those services. Are there any existing dependencies between the different modules that we have to, let's say, entangle in order to make these new business models, these new data spaces? And what are the data standards and the interoperability elements that we are having to use. Probably we will listen about the means and developed for the smart city in the smart city context, or different types of standards that can be developed or that can be reused. So these are very relevant questions if we need to settle a data space. And also legal and governance. Definitely, we have to adapt to the regulatory space, or conversely, identify what are the regulatory changes that are needed in order to allow for these data spaces to work, for this society to evolve efficiently and also from a just perspective. This will have to be associated also with a just transition, not only the digital transition, in a green transition, but definitely a social transformation linked with the EU values. So basically, when we're talking about the legal and the regulatory framework, we're talking about understanding and reflecting about which is the framework that is available, or in which is the framework that will be needed in order to allow that to happen. We have the GDPR legislation and regulation now, which represents the basis for that to be developed, further developed. But then we have to be operational. We are talking about a multi-stakeholder approach. In our multi-stakeholder approach, we understand which is the operational governance framework, how we are all the stakeholders interacting with each specific role and each specific commitment in order to make the model work. And if this is happening, if we are dealing with a multi-stakeholder approach, then the clear question that happens afterwards is, how do we gain the trust? How do we build trust about this new model in which organizations from different types and perspectives and orientations are going to be part? Finally, technology. Technology is not the core, but it is the heart of it. What technology stacks? Open source implementations, standard specifications. Will we use different types of technologies, one single type of technology going into the cloud, or distributed in a federated model, etc.? So we are linking in some way the aspect of the governance together with the aspect of technology. We are starting from the beginning with available tools and available software tools and hardware tools that we will definitely implement. I will need to understand which are the requirements for potential future technology in order to develop our data spaces. We will probably hear a number of examples and have the chance to discuss about the current state of the art regarding the technology and which are the challenges that these technology elements are having. All right, so following on with the bibliography that you can find in the document that we identified before, the starter kit, we can have at 101, the starter point. If you don't know nothing about data spaces, or if you are just willing to have an initial grasp on that, I would definitely recommend some of the publications that are identified in the Data Spaces 101. The starting point, the entry point. If you are more focused on the business value and models, probably you will be interested in checking out the international dataspace.org, and probably also the position paper on new business model for data spaces around data sovereignty, because data sovereignty is in some way, let's say, one of the issues or the hot topics that we will deal with also in our presentation today. So plenty of interesting approaches, not only the way in which we are storing the data, but all of the way in which we as citizens govern our data. So also regarding the regulatory aspects, legal landscape, and governance models, you can find a number of interesting interesting publications, rule books, and other contribution around regulation, building for a fairer data economy. And if you are more interested into the technology, I would recommend these 5. approaches that are also present in the starter kit. This is very important also to understand, which is the, let's say, the starting point, right? In order to create, which is the minimum viable data space. Let's say, what is the minimum that we have to implement, right, in order to, in some way, consistently say that we are having a data space, which are the minimum ingredients that technically allow for the functionality that we have mentioned before. So really interesting. Please have a look at it if you are having the chance. And finally, as I was mentioning before, we are probably having access to one of the most relevant hot topics that we are having in the technology field. Many institutions are developing efforts to the development of the data spaces. We will have some of them that we are having here in our presentation today from different perspectives. A number of also of stakeholders that come either from the academic world or for the private sector or for public-private consortia. So we are having the chance to understand now which this distributed governance for data is going to change the way in which we understand also the collaboration between the public and the private sector. Particularly from the point of view of DT4 regions, this will be very interesting because it will feed the European public servants with the basics, with the, let's say, starting point, the entry point, in order to access all the knowledge that we have already available, and this is evolving very quickly. Good. With this, we are having a quick introduction about the topic that we are going to have the chance to talk about and to discuss today. But for that, we need experts, a panel of experts with whom we are going to have the chance to eventually discuss and have a number of projects. We would like to welcome Sophie Metzaros, a project manager of the project DS4CCC. Sophie, hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, very much welcome. Thank you very much for coming along. Also, we have Iker Gonzalez, Innovation Manager at ENoLL. Hello, Iker.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to share our experience.
Thank you for coming along. We also have Roberto Garcia, Associate Professor of Greater Space CCA from Universidad de Lleida. Roberto?
Hello, happy to be here.
We're really happy to have you here too. And we don't have the chance to have Atunwe Conan. He excused in the last minutes, but in any case, we thank you very much also, Tanguy, in order for accepting our invitation. We'll have another chance in order to listen to his presentation. So, first of all, let us start now with a number of clear approaches. Let us settle down this general framework that we have already presented regarding data spaces. And eventually, I would like to introduce you Sophie Metzaros, she's an OAS project manager taking care of the initiative European Data Space for Smart and Sustainable Cities and Communities. Sophie is also a researcher focusing on trust in data sharing and in data spaces. We will talk about trust a lot in this afternoon, if I'm not wrong, Sophie. And also with the Vrije University Brussels, IMEX Smith VUB. She also brings in her expertise on European innovation, inclusion, and policy development. Sophie, hello, thank you again for being here. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. May I share my screen?
Yes, please.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So as promised, there will be no surprises. I will indeed go on to talk about the data space for smart cities and communities. So actually, like much of what I wanted to say, Fernando, you already very well described and contextualized the project. But I will still turn back just to introduce our project as well, to the whole idea of why we have data spaces for cities and communities. So essentially the idea is that cities and communities are in very well positioned in this data ecosystem because they can be both the consumer and provider of data and services. However, as we know, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with how the public sector works, they really often work in silos, and those silos are not necessarily interoperable with each other. So they have different ways of registering information, storing information, and therefore the exchange of that information can be challenging. But if we actually had a way to solve it, then decision-making processes could benefit from that. So what is the idea here? That we have the Digital Euro program, which is a funding scheme of Europe, and it's actually quite strategic how they go on to fund different digital projects. So on the one hand, about a year ago, so 2022 October, a bunch of sectorial data spaces, European sectorial data spaces kicked off. So data spaces, I'm sure you know, have this ability to organize data in a thematic manner, for example, for a use case on a local or national or even on a European level. And why is this good? Because we can then actually have that data, which comes from a variety of sources in one place, and use that for AI-driven innovations, for example, like the digital twins. And as we recently started talking about it, the Cityverse as well is also coming. Now, another Digital Euro funded program, which is also relevant here, is the testing and experimentation facilities. So the idea is that once you have the data spaces, you can build on them to have your data-driven AI innovation, but that you can actually develop in a safe, secure environment, which is a TAF, the testing and experimentation facility. And these are also sectorial. So these funding programs are funding these projects in a parallel so that we can all evolve together in a coherent manner. And as such, as I said, so the idea is that we have cities where information can be scattered and they're not necessarily stored in a way that it can be interoperable across sectors. Data spaces actually carry this opportunity to overcome this issue. So, for example, here's an example that if you were to have the reservations estimations of hotels and you combine that with the airport passengers, you could actually go to look at public transport and optimize it. So here you go from different environments, collecting data to impact one specific domain. So essentially, the idea is that it would enable cross-domain decision making across domain data space. Such is also interesting because when we talk about sectorial data spaces, we have a lot of, I'm sure you will hear about it, a lot of data spaces that are public, they are mobility oriented or skills oriented, and cities are the DS4, as you see, is a cross-domain data space. So we work with a variety of use cases, we combine them. And so in reality, where are we and what does it look like? So the way this project is envisioned is that there is the first 12 months is focusing on creating the blueprint of the data space together with an idea of how to deploy it or a plan on how to deploy it. And once that 12 months is over, there will be a deployment phase. Another consortium will be awarded to lead the deployment phase. And this is when the actual blueprint will be realized. So whatever we worked on, that will actually become reality. And what we already know is that the deployment phase will call on cities and communities to apply to be sites of pilots. It will be a cascading funding system. So it means that cities or communities that already have it on their digital agenda to have a data space, they could actually embark on this journey to actually have some support from Europe to realize data spaces in this environment. How does it look like? How do we actually work on creating and realize, envisioning and building this data space? So we actually have we have dedicated work packages to create different aspects of the data space. So as Fernando also hinted upon these building blocks, we are working on the blueprint consists of a governance aspect, so a non-technical part and a technical part, and that will be accompanied and brought together in the deployment roadmap, so the data space establishment work package. But we are not pulling these ideas out of thin air. So this is all based on research as well as interaction with the stakeholders. So we have a stakeholder forum that consists of 150 individuals from a diverse set of background. So it's both from supply and demand, and we interact with them on a regular basis. So we bring our work to the stakeholder forum and have them approve it, disapprove it, iterate upon it, so that we can be sure that we're going to create something that's actually inclusive and addresses the needs of cities and communities. And along these efforts, we also have a dedicated work package to capacity building. So we also understand that there is this idea of leave no one behind. So we are also looking at what can be the challenges of adopting data spaces. So we are also including this in our work to understand how we can actually, what kind of resources should we provide in order to enable cities and communities to adopt data spaces. So what kind of, so this is just an idea, just a little visualization of how this stakeholder forum, you should imagine it. So we have on the one hand, the demand and the supply side. However, this is actually a CSA of the Living-in-EU movement that Fernando also talked about earlier. So Living-in-EU movement actually brings together the supply and demand side. And the idea behind it is that it's a platform which is to facilitate the collaboration between demand and supply side and enable digital transformation across Europe. So here, and as such, this is a CSA of the Living-in-EU movement. So we follow this similar mindset, and we bring together the demand and the supply side, and we very much overlap with the Living-in-EU movement stakeholders. So we are open to the environment, to the ecosystem here, and we have workshop surveys and interviews to actually create our deliverables. So what are our outputs? We are going to have a governance scheme, a multi-stakeholder governance scheme, a catalog of specifications, a roadmap, and a capacity building. So far, in total, we're going to have 7 events, so stakeholder forum workshops. We also had an expression of interest form where we called upon European communities and cities to submit their interests to eventually become a site of piloting. This is to ensure that we have in our community all the people and individuals and stakeholders who are actually interested in this domain. We also had a survey, and we also conduct interviews. Now the stakeholder forum has a bit more individuals in there, but I should update that number. So we have the governance aspect. That already is again like how is it exactly that the governance plan is working. So it's led by Justine from Eurocities, and she works together. She has a clear work plan, and she has a core governance group that she interacts with alongside with her desk research to make sure that she can come up with something more tangible that she can then go to present to the wider stakeholder forum. And then there is the technical part, technical blueprint part. So again, it refers to some of the things that Fernando said. So obviously it's a sector, it's a data space. So we are responding to the data space support center. We are in alignment with them. So we also adapted the OpenDI framework, which is the one that you see on the screen. And we actually mapped the MIMs, so the minimal interoperability mechanisms onto them to ensure that that these technical building blocks will be interoperable and accessible to all. Now, I'm not entirely sure who in the audience is familiar with the MIMS and who is not. If we have time later for that, I'm happy to also talk about that. So what is it that you can actually see now? I invite you to visit our website. We have all the information available there. Now we are already caught up with because it's been quite challenging since it's a very fast-paced project. It's only 1 year. But now we have everything on the website. You can see our deliverables there, a short version. If you want to access the longer version, it's there. That means that there is a document which will describe the landscape. So if you want to understand what are the data spaces in this ecosystem, in what networks do they tie into, which organizations, we provide a document on that. We have the catalog of specifications. So it's about technical building blocks. We have an online inventory for that. So it's also to make it a bit more interactive and easier to absorb. We also produce a white paper, which will shortly be available for public. And then we have the capacity building exercises that will be led by Giacomo, who is also here in the audience from ENoLL. And then we also have a newsletter. So you're also, if you have any questions, you can also always reach out to me, but you're welcome to sign up to the newsletter itself. So in case of you have any questions, then please reach out.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for the very excellent summary in a short time, which is basically what you're doing with this sprint as well. There is this project of 1 year, so you are really being busy and entertained with a lot of stuff to be done in short time. You were mentioning, I want to ask you a quick question regarding one of the comments that you made. Maybe we will have time later to exchange together with the rest of the participants and also the audience. But you were mentioning the link with the MIMS. You're right. Probably not all the attendees are familiar, or the people who are looking or listening to the webinar after this presentation, which will be shared online as part of the capacity building provided by DT4REGIONs. Could you have a summary, let's say, about which is the ambition of the MIMS, which is the objective of the MIMS, and how they are going to link finally to the data spaces?
So the MIMS are it's called the minimal interoperability mechanisms, and the idea is that we have right now at the moment 10 MIMS. Now, I will not go into the governance part of it. It's just what's the MIMS itself. We have 10 MIMS, and the idea is that it pertains to certain subjects that have to be interoperable across communities and cities, that we can actually build a common and shared market. So, for example, we have the first MIM is context information management. So it will outline what kind of resources are available to manage your the context information of your data. Because the idea is that city A and city B, or even if you're just talking about within city A, from different, what we talked about, that there are silos, they will have, let's say about, if we talk about public transport, not public, mobility. So let's say like we have a sensor and that is registering the passengers. So let's say it's called human, bike, and car. But the other sensor from another city will call it 1, 2, 3. And they want to exchange that information, but they will not the machine will not understand that 1, 2, 3 means human, bike, and car, because this information is not interoperable. So the idea is that we have to find the minimal way to enable interoperability across cities and communities. And the other aspect of it is also that this would avoid a vendor lock-in, that because the more specific we go, if we have like really strict specific standardization across cities, that it will no longer be open. It will no longer be accessible for everyone, and it will not, it will just create a monopoly essentially.
Great. So there is a lot of work to be done here on the development, I understand, for some of the means. Not all of them have been developed. So we're in the right moment now in order
Yes.
to go on and to get up continuing. So yes, I think that we will have more time later in order to understand this interoperability that Sophie, I understand that is one of the keys of the development of the data space from the different projects. So thank you very much, Sophie. Let me share again my screen with you, and we're moving on to our next presenter. I would like to introduce you now Iker Gonzalez, Innovation Manager at E2CAT Foundation in Barcelona, Catalonia. E2CAT is the foundation that is working in the digital transformation based on the internet and new technologies. Iker is working in the research field of big data and distributed architecture, so specialized in data space implementation in the mobility sector, if I'm not wrong. So we are having the chance to start with a general approach, then go for the specific blueprint definition, and then let's go down and down, going to one specific example, which is the mobility sector that eventually Iker will have the chance to present us with. Iker, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Let me know you can see it. Can you see my slides?
Yes, but it is not full screen yet.
Let me know if it's full screen already.
Not yet. So what we are seeing is like the
PowerPoint version,
the
right?
presentation, yes, the presentation mode.
Okay, that's odd because I'm putting the full presentation mode, but I'm guessing
probably you're having you did not select the displays for the presentation in the. Okay, a second. Maybe I can help you. If you're going to the. Okay. Yes, now we are not seeing your screen now. Okay, it's still in presentation mode. Okay, let's see.
Well, if you want, I can just present it from here. Just make it a little bit.
Or maybe, Odd, could you present it on?
Oh yeah, or if Odd can present it, then we can. Yep.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
we
was
can see
saying all its glory. Good.
Perfect, fantastic.
Okay, your turn.
Thank you very much, and sorry for that. I don't know why my screen is not going full screen. But in any case, thank you for inviting me to share our experience. Today I will be talking about the experience of E2CAT implementing data spaces. The presentation that I will be doing will be more focused into the technical part. We are a research center, so we develop the technology and we try to implement it via use cases. So if you can move to the next slide. Before I start, I would like to make a quick introduction about E2CAT. E2CAT is, as Fernando mentioned, we are a research and innovation center based in Barcelona. We are specialized in advanced technologies, and we are committed to design and build the future of a digital society by leveraging the knowledge that we gather from European and national projects in the fields of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, blockchain, 6G, IoT, immersive technologies, and aerospace communications. We partner with companies, public administrations, academia, and users to leverage all of this knowledge to create use cases to meet real and social business challenges. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Our board of trustees is formed by public administration and universities and private companies. And that being said, with this quick introduction, I will now start to go a little bit deeper into into which areas we work with the data spaces. Data spaces is currently work from out of the distributed artificial intelligence department, specifically in the big data research line. What can you please go to the next one? Thank you. So data spaces, as Fernando and Sophie mentioned, this is a growing technology. It's an ongoing technology, and I2CAT participates in the development of this technology actively, right? So we are partners with initiatives such as International Data Space Association. We are partners both on a regional and a European level with Gaia-X, and we're also partners with Big Data Value Association. So the way we implement these data spaces is via the International Data Space Reference Architecture model. Basically, International Data Space Associations, for those who don't know, they created a reference architecture for all of us looking to create use cases of data spaces, for us to have main guidelines on how to implement these, and they are creating the ground technology for us to implement this, right? And we focus primarily on verticals such as smart mobility and Industry 4.0. We act as consulting for proof of concept and an experimentation partner. We are a data space node operator, and we are an added value data service developer. So that being said, I just did a quick introduction about I2CAT and where we are implementing data spaces. Now I will move on to the next part, which is how we are implementing the data spaces. And I will be giving you a bit of more of the technical perspective of how we approach the use cases. But if you could move to the next. Thank you. So when we have in our hands a project, a data space project, we split it into four different phases, right? So first we need to define the use case, we then design it, and then we implement it, and then we try to scale, well, not try to, then we evaluate whether we need to scale up that project. So in this first phase of use case definition, we need to identify what are the challenges that we need to address with that partner. Let's say we have a client or a partner that is looking to implement a use case in the mobility sector, and we need to identify which are the challenges or what are the business values that we need to create. And with this data space solution, we need to identify which are the stakeholders involved in a data space, because as you know, a data space cannot be done by one user. It needs to be done by multiple stakeholders. The value of a data space is sharing data, right? And one thing that Sophie mentioned, and it's really important, is that we need to break the barriers of sharing of the data silos, right? So we need to understand what are the sharing barriers, which normally are data silos, and we need to see how we can break those data silos to create a valuable data space. And once we have that part of the definition, then we move on into the design phase. And this is a very important element in working in data spaces. And this would be in the design phase, we need to start looking at what are the data sources that will be available in the data space, right? So for example, we will first start with the partner that we are working on. So we have this partner that's looking to create a mobility data space use case. We need to see what are the data sources that they have available. We need to see the technical needs or what are the technical aspects involved from this partner. Let's say if they are using data warehousing, data lakes, where are they storing this information, right? We need to evaluate if this client, how they want to put forward this data, what conditions, what usage conditions they want to put. We need to evaluate the quality. And of course, once we finish this, we need to start working with the other stakeholders to repeat this process and see what information and how they have it and how they can put this forward, right? And there's a key element in here that is defined interaction between stakeholders. A data space, as I already said, it depends on the collaboration of multiple stakeholders, right? So if you're defining and implementing a use case, it's really, really important to make sure that you have a good working relationship with the other stakeholders, because otherwise not having a good, maybe you think you have a good working relationship, but down the line, they need to put resources, they need to put time, they need to put people to work on this. So it's very, very important to make sure that they are willing to participate and they are willing to open their data sets into this data space. Of course, a data space is a way to open data in a secure, sovereign way, right? So because we have usage policies, there's traceability, there's interoperability, but we need to make sure that those other stakeholders understand the concept. So we do to have this job of let's say teaching the other stakeholders the value of a data space, right? And in this design part, it's also very important to take a moment to evaluate the state of the art, right? So data spaces is a technology that is always growing, is evolving, is a new technology that is constantly being updated by different partners. So before you start doing any implementation, you need to go into the reference architecture model from International Data Space Association in our case, and we need to see what are the connectors that are being currently used and what are the state of these connectors or any other applications that we want to use in our data space. Once we have all of this part defined, the design and the use case definition, then we move on to the next part, which would be the implementation, right? So in here, we will start working with a minimum valuable data space. We normally go through the first iterations, then we start to involve all the stakeholders, we start to implement the connectors, because as one of the key elements of a data space is the connector, right? Because through the connector is where you have all of these security and sovereignty of your data sets. So we start implementing the connectors to each of the stakeholders, and then we start doing the sharing part, and we start evaluating results, and we start running the first simulations of this of this data space. And afterwards, once we have the first results, then we start to decide if we should be scaling up that data space, if we should start adding new stakeholders, new applications, and so on. If you can move into the next slide. And this part it's important. This is more about implementation. As tech people, we focus into implementing data spaces through incremental implementation. We first need to ensure that we have a minimum viable data space. And actually, this was something that Fernando was mentioning before. And this is a chart that can describe what a minimal viable data space looks like, right? So basically, it is composed of a connector and an identity certification component. Normally, from I2CAD, what we try to let's say, put forward to our partners is let's make a data space composed of 3 different connectors. Why? Because with 3 different connectors, you will start to see the value of a data space, because you will have data providers, data consumers, and a service provider. And this service provider can provide benefit for both of the data consumer, and the data provider. So that's normally the way we approach this minimum viable data space. We create 3 connectors, we implement the usage policies, and then we have the identity certification component that it's always looking for those connectors to be certified, right? Because it's very important that all of the participants are correctly certified and identified, because it's one of the key elements of the data space. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The next part is, once we have a fully working minimum viable data space, then we can start adding the additional components of the data space, right? And these additional common services could be the App Store, common vocabularies, transaction log, and the broker, right? So Sophie was mentioning the memes. So for example, the common vocabularies would be a way to approach any issues with interoperability, right? Because in these common vocabularies, you will be putting forward what each variable means and how it is described, right? So the application store would be additional services that can be used within the data space, right? So you need to anonymize data, you need to do pre-processing, maybe you need to run some machine learning algorithms on the data space. So basically, providers, they can upload apps to the App Store, and that could provide an additional service to this data space. Then you have the clearinghouse, which is basically a way to record any financial transaction that is done within the data space. And of course, the broker. This is really important. The broker is basically a centralized catalog where all of the providers, they upload information about what data they have available, right, into this catalog, so that any data consumer can come into this catalog and browse what information is available in this data space before going into any data provider. This is the only centralized part. The main concept of a data space is this centralization. So all of the data sets will be on each of the data providers. They only upload to the catalog the information of what is available on their data space. And the next part, if you can move to the next slide, please, thank you, would be the expansion or the incremental part of the scaling up of the data space. So now we have the common services. Should we start scaling up the project, adding new providers, new consumers, new services, or even connecting data spaces, right? That's like the goal in the future of a data space, is to start connecting data spaces across different regions or even different verticals. So this is the way we approach when the data spaces. This is how we normally approach the use cases. But there's a really interesting methodology that actually Fernando already mentioned. It's the Data Sharing Coalition Center created a methodology to describe data spaces. Or if we can go to the next slide, and we thought it would be it would be worth mentioning because we also use it, and it's really, really useful. If you're starting a project from scratch, you can use this reference, right? So they guide you through different steps of how you can create this use case and how you can take it forward and how you can start implementing it. We left the link to download this definition methodology. And in here, I was talking before about the interaction complexity. They even provide in step 4 an interaction complexity template. So they already are giving you tools to evaluate the interaction complexity between the stakeholders, right? So because it's a key and a very important part when working in a data space. Now, this last part of my presentation will be focused around giving you examples of data spaces, right? If we can move to the next one, thank you. Next. And I will first start with a Lighthouse project in Germany, the mobility data space. This is actually a reference for us. This already involves more than 200 stakeholders from OEMs, traffic control system, local authorities, mobility service providers, and so on. On the right side of the image, you can actually see there's already renowned brands working on this data space. Each of them is provided with a connector. They upload metadata to the catalog. Each of them can see what information is available on this data space. And there are some really interesting use cases that can come out of this mobility data space. If we can go to the next one, please. And these are two examples that I chose because these are actually really related to us end users, right? So we have this local hazard information for server driving condition use case. So basically, OEM brands such as Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, they share information via IoT devices. They upload information to the data space about hazards in the road. Right, so let's say a Mercedes-Benz car detects a crosswind or an icy road, then it uploads this information to the data space, and Volkswagen and BMW may be connected to that connector, and they receive this information and they can inform the driver of those cars about that potential hazard. And that way, the end user, the driver, can take a proactive adjustment of their navigation route to make a safer route. So, and the other part would be the smart parking solution. That's another interesting use case. Basically, in here, what's happening, we are connecting with local authorities, local businesses, and also OEMs. And via applications, the local businesses, they warn users or drivers about empty parking spots, right? And they warn the drivers about this empty spot with the objective of reducing parking surge traffic to lower pollution in the cities, right? So there's a bigger objective in here. And basically what they do is warn the user, and they can provide a customized offering if they use that parking spot. So basically that would be an idea, right? So these are really interesting projects. There's a bunch of other use cases in the mobility data space. I chose these ones because these are really relatable for us as end users of a car. So it's actually quite interesting to see. And now for this next part, I will share some examples of I2CAD projects that we have been working on. If we can go to the next slide. This is a project that we implemented a data space. As I mentioned, we normally focus our projects with three connectors. In this case, we did a project with Mosaic Factor in collaboration with the Universitat Politécnica de Catalunya. So Mosaic Factor is a synthetic data provider. Basically, they had this anonymization algorithm. This anonymization, for those who don't know, it's a process where you need to take private data from a data provider, and you need to anonymize this information to make it available for another service provider in a way that no one can actually trace back or regenerate that data to actually identify the real user of that data. So in this case, Mosaic Factor wanted to test their algorithm. And what we did is we created this data space with 3 connectors. We identified a stakeholder, which in this case would be a parking service provider with EV charging stations, where they provided EV charging information about cars and so on into the data space. They shared this information to Mosaic via the IDS connector. In this case, Mosaic Factor was in charge through the IDS connector to anonymize this information and then send it to an analytical solution provider. And this analytical solution provider, basically what they did was to make analysis on EV charging station deployment, electric grid usage optimization, pricing personalization. But the key point in here is that through this sharing of data and this anonymization process, this analysis solution provider would not be able to decipher who that end user was, right? Because that is data that is already anonymized. This was an IDS compliant solution to share data between the interested actors or the interested entities in this data space. And real data from the provider was actually used. So it was very important for this synthetic data to work. And if we can go to the next one. And this last project that we are working on right now is a micro-mobility bike sharing system optimization that we're actually working with EuroCat together with also with the Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya, with CIDAI. These are regional research organizations in Catalonia, and we're working with Bicing and the local city hall of Barcelona. Basically, in here, we are connecting Bicing, which is the bike sharing service provider of Barcelona City, with a data provider of data of traffic information and pollution information on the city, right? So we are connecting this information to create an analysis, and we are sending this information all the way to a service provider that will provide analytical AIs on this data and create visualizations. So this is an ongoing project, but the main objectives are to optimize the availability and service level agreements of public bike sharings in the city of Barcelona, do like usage forecasting, virtual station and event detections, also optimize the battery level because these bike stations, they include both electrical and non-electrical bicycles, and integrate with traffic information, event calendars, if there are any important events that can disrupt the service of the bicycles and so on. So taking into account. So this is an ongoing project, but it's also an IDS compliant solution. So as I mentioned, our work is, we primarily are focused on implementing international data space reference architecture, and all of our projects are going through this architecture. So that would be all. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to now have this. You guided us hand by hand in all the process for the data space design. Thank you very much for this. I think it is very valuable. Also, I took very good note about this relevance of the minimum viable data space that has the role of being the first implementation, right? Start having the ball rolling, basically,
exactly,
right? In order to go on developing the data space. Also very much interesting also this definition of the three elements or the three actors that we probably, you recommend us to start with this data provider, the data service provider, and the data service users, right? And so I have so many questions now for you. I really don't know where to start with, but we will have the chance to develop it later. But for instance, let me ask about something that you were mentioning in the last part of the process, the scaling up, right? When we are, I don't know if you had the chance to develop this scale up phase in the projects in which we are working, because you talked about this open data in a secure sovereign way. I understand that when you are scaling it up in order to introduce new stakeholders into the process, or in some way that could create attention, should create attention, or the redefinition of the governance model, or should it imply an adaptation, a direct adaptation, to the model that was defined? How do you perceive this scaling up phase in terms of the definition of the process?
I would not perceive it as a point of friction between participants, right? Because each of the data providers, you as a data provider, you have your data sets and you create your usage policies. And you put forward, okay, so this is my data set. These are the usage policies that I have on my data. And the data space is built, the connector is built to make sure that those policies are actually in a way enforced, right? So any data consumer cannot bypass those usage policies. So in a way, it's a secure and sovereign way. The International Data Space Association, it provides specific guidelines on how the governance should work, right? So there needs to be traceability. You as the connector by itself, it keeps track of who's accessing your data, when it was accessed, what specific variables it got or what specific data sets it got. So there's a lot of components in terms of keeping track of what's actually happening, of making sure that the governance is correctly implemented and governance it's correctly followed. So it should not really create any frictions between participants, because at the end you already know what you're going into, right? You already know that you are participating in a data space where a data provider is giving you a data set with a set of rules, let's say, and you need to, as a consumer, you need to abide by those rules of the data provider.
Thank you very much. We will definitely have the chance to keep on with the different questions. You were mentioning the Gaia X project as well, and probably as let's say popular culture in data spaces is something that we should speak about in the next minutes. But before that, please let me share my screen again, and let's go with the next presenter. Our next presenter is Roberto Garcia. So I have the pleasure to introduce Roberto to you. Roberto is Associate Professor and Deputy Vice Rector for Research and Transfer at Universidad de Lleida in Catalonia, Spain. Roberto has more than 20 years of experience in research and innovation applying semantic knowledge in different domains. More recently, he's exploring Web3 and a combination of semantic and decentralization technologies like blockchain, and for instance, applying Web3 to guarantee data sovereignty. We already talked about that very clearly in what was mentioned before as data space, in a way of opening data in a secure and sovereign way. For instance, applying Web3 to guarantee data sovereignty through data spaces, especially in the agriculture domain. So now we're having probably the chance to have another different space of application. So Roberto, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will share my screen then. Check if it works. Okay, let me check. Okay. Now I can.
Good.
Okay, so can you see my screen?
Very well.
Okay. Okay, so basically, as it has been introduced by Fernando, the idea is to present the work that we are carrying on in Agri-Data Space project. This is a CSA that is trying to build the roadmap towards this data space in agriculture. I will focus especially on the participation from Universidad de Lleida, which are a part of the team participating in this project. Basically, this is a project of 18 months that started October last year and will run till March next year. And we're basically this consortium of partners, all of them quite involved in the agriculture domain, being on both research institutions, but also organizations that represent farmers, machinery builders, and so on. So all these stakeholders in that particular domain. And with the aim of defining an architecture, a way of representing data in this specific domain, so it's integrated and interoperable, and also taking into account other very important aspects, especially in this case, that are the legal and ethical aspects. So just to provide an overview of what we are working on, these are the work packages. Basically, just say that we have a first work package that is trying to build the landscape, the mapping of existing data sharing initiatives, how they are working. And from that, we drive in work package 2 an analysis more of the governance, business models, legislation, and ethical aspects. And in work package 3, we focus on more the technological landscape. So basically from all these, in work package 4, the idea is to build this roadmap that helps in the future develop these kind of data spaces. And just to provide some small pictures of what we are doing right now, basically, for instance, in work package 1, we are mapping this data sharing landscape specifically in agriculture, identifying existing data systems for data sharing that are already working, maybe not guided by these data spaces principles, but already being able to share data between, for instance, farmers and other kinds of organizations. Also, from the agricultural point of view, also initiatives that are specific, for instance, ISOBUS, that is to connect the machinery with the farm management information system. So there are a lot of topics here in this domain that are specific. Also vocabularies that are very, very relevant in this case, and maybe deviate a little from what we have seen more related with cities and mobility and so on. And also a very important topic, it's not a legal text, but it's what is called the Code of Conduct. That is the Code of Conduct for Agricultural Data Sharing. That is something that has generated from the community of stakeholders themselves. It's already in place. And it's basically these guidelines of how data should be shared, that the farmers should keep control on the data, be informed when it is shared, the uses that are done with that data. So in many senses, it's like something that advanced a little the Future Data Act that is being worked on right now. And in fact, some parts of the Data Act were inspired by this Code of Conduct. So very relevant also here. And then the software and infrastructure part, that is the common players in this case, already mentioned in many of the presentations before, from GaiaX to Fireware to iShare, and all the associations around data spaces working on this topic. Another topic that has been mentioned, very relevant, is data sovereignty. This is specifically something that we are working on Work Package 2, because we are involved in the ethical aspects work task in that work package. And we have tried to analyze this concept of data sovereignty from the ethical standpoint. In this case, it's based on values, trying to map the values and the different kinds of stakeholders that we can identify. Here, we just group them into 4 main groups, from public bodies to farmers and farmer associations, advisors, technology providers, and then society as a whole. And then trying to analyze which is the impact of this data sovereignty, that is basically guarantee that who is originating the data has control over it. What are the values that are impacted positively? That is the value capture. For instance, for farmers is ownership. Some negative outcomes that we can also identify, and there are some risks associated to that, like privacy, and then opportunities that emerge as a result of putting data sovereignty in the center and taking care of these values and how they are impacted. For instance, informed consent for the farmers. So every kind of use of the data that they generate, it's informed to them so they can agree or not. And also in this transparent setting, they can better make an idea about the value of their data. That is a big problem for them, because data at the level of the individual farmer has no value, but when aggregated is when it appears. So that is a very important driver for us, also the ethical aspects. Also, from the technological standpoint, what we have started to do, and maybe it's a little messy here, but it's basically trying to identify all the systems that are actually sharing data in the context of agriculture. So basically, in the bottom part, we have what could be the farm management information system, farm devices, machinery, platforms that help farmers work with their data. But then on top of that, and this is the biggest part of the picture, is all the systems that are emerging from the regulatory aspects associated with agriculture. And this is a very dominated by the regulations sector. There are regulations for almost every kind of of topic that we can imagine, from milk, how it is collected, how it should be composed, and how it has to be treated, monitoring individual animals for livestock, also all the treatments that are carried on the fields. All these aspects are monitored and reported somehow. So we also take care of trying to take this also into account, so we don't have just data spaces business to business, but also in this case, a very important to mention business to government and government to government, because then from national states to European level, there are a lot of transfers of information that nowadays they are mostly done by hand. So this is something that data spaces should take care of. So just providing some additional glimpses of our work in this project. Also, we are very interested in interoperability and semantic technologies. Here, there's a lot of work related with ontologies for agriculture from all points of view, from a genetic point of view till societal, economical aspects, agronomic practices, and so on. So taking all that into account. And also other topics that have been also mentioned, like sensors and how we capture that data. And we'll provide an example of that. And because our idea is also to try to work based on use cases. So we keep our feet on the ground. So we have started to work with examples of data, in this case from a pig farm. And also these are basically tabular data. We have started to experiment with existing minimal implementations of data spaces. In our case, is the minimum viable Gaia-X implementation that is like a portal that I will show also later. And then what we are trying to apply is a principle that is pushed by the real-time linked data spaces book that was also referenced at the beginning, that we find it very interesting, because if we try to make our data interoperable from the beginning, it's a big effort, and this is a big barrier that many are not able to jump. So our approach is what is called in this book the pay-as-you-go model. The idea is that you share the data the way you have. This might be a CSV, some tabular data, as I showed just before. We shared that. And the idea is that this way you reduce the cost of joining the data space, and then all the integration effort is done later as it is needed. So you pay as you go. And in that sense, we have this small example of starting from this tabular data that, based on this principle and the way of classifying things from 1 to 5 stars, will be a 2 stars data set, this tabular data, to a model using semantic technologies, many of the ontologies, in this case for sensors, like SAREF and many of the specific ontologies around SAREF. So this is a model of just one line of this file, but providing a lot of context, additional context that will help working with this data. And to conclude, we also want to share our experiments, because as I mentioned, in addition to defining this roadmap, in parallel, we are trying to explore actual implementations, actual data sharing of these technologies, and also trying to look for different approaches. In this case, we like this approach that tries to guarantee technical control over the data. So there is no way to access the data if you don't go through the consent of the person that is controlling. So the idea is that data sovereignty is provided by design. And the technologies that we're exploring in this case are called compute to data. That is basically that the data doesn't leave the control of the originator, and it's the algorithm who visits the data. So it's what moves. So what you have to take care then is that this algorithm behaves properly and doesn't take the data, just the results or the trained model at the end. Trust execution environments, in the case that you cannot have the data in the farm itself, but in a trusted execution environment, also blockchain and self-sovereign identity solutions. And in that sense, we are experimenting with all these in experimental deployment on this minimum viable Gaia-X portal, where it's implemented based on these principles. The big difference maybe is that you don't just share datasets, you also share algorithms. So you share both kinds of components. It implements compute to data. And the idea is that you can run scenarios like one that we try to start experimenting with, that is in which the farmers share pictures weighting the pigs, so you can see the scale digits. The idea is that researchers can use these pictures to train automatically weighting algorithms based on that data, but without the farmers losing the control over the images. And then also keeping track of who has shared what with whom, and provide this traceability, or based on this traceability, a way to compensate the originators. So farmers, for instance, can have access to this automatic weighting algorithm for free if they have contributed to its training. And these are just screenshots of this tool, how you can select a particular dataset that you have uploaded. You can define which are the algorithms that you allow this data to be accessed by. And also all this is based on blockchain technology, so you have to sign the transactions. So no one else than you can do that in principle, unless they stole your passwords. And also here we see how you can order a compute job that is basically to send the algorithm to the data and just come out with the results, a log of what has happened, and the results of that, in this case, can be, if it's a training, to implement federated training, so you can build partial parts of the final model and then combining them all to build the final algorithm. And that's basically all. Hope it was useful to you, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and thank you also for providing such detail also on key concepts. For instance, we will probably have the chance to develop some of the dimensions of data sovereignty that, thanks to you, we already know much better. Also, how, from projects that we are collaborating together, we are also trying to identify which is the role of farmers as data providers as well, right? And another element that I found interesting is also the algorithm as data to share as well, as something to share as well, into this certified and safe, secure, sovereign way. So I have, again, a number of questions, but since this is the second one that appears today, and you have had clearly experience on that, you already mentioned two examples of the Gaia-X project, right? So if you could probably share, for those who are not familiar with the Gaia-X project, that I understand is one of the reference points, right, for those who are working in data spaces. Could you provide us with a little bit of insight regarding why is that relevant, Gaia-X, for the data space community?
Well, basically, there are some initiatives that are trying to make the specification part, which are the parts, how they can be built and so on. And then Gaia-X is more an initiative from industry. It started from industry, of how to implement minimum versions of that. That's why they are all called minimum viable. One is data space, the other is Gaia-X, okay? So basically the idea is to bootstrap all this ecosystem with something that can be used, implemented, and deployed. So I think that's the main objective of Gaia-X, and setting the table with all the different pieces and minimal implementation, so all these ideals can start making them reality.
Okay, thank you very much, Roberto. Maybe we can have the chance now to start since we don't have the chance to have with us Tanguy Konin, maybe we can have the chance also to start among us a small talk regarding some of the questions that were presented at the beginning. So probably from your experience, maybe I can go directly to Sophie. Sophie, you are part of a project that in some way are connecting many different initiatives, right? And different approaches for the data space community. What do you think that is the challenge that you find more relevant or more difficult, or that creates, let's say, more friction now in the development? Because we have seen a number of dimensions. We have seen that there is a strong regulatory aspect here. We don't know if it is hindering or not the development. How do you perceive the technology maturity? How do you perceive also capacity building, which is something that we didn't speak too much, but I understand that it is essential as well. So what would you be, from your big picture that you are having now, what do you think that it is the most urgent or relevant aspect to tackle today?
Well, I think your question already shows that there is a great diversity in the ecosystem. So it's when we are talking about a European scene, there is going to be diversity in terms of the maturity of the digital solutions, as well as of the resources available for those, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about solutions that is to address a European-wide community, it should address this diversity. And I think what a lot of these initiatives are trying to do is to do it together so that we will not be fragmented and scattered around again. So I think the challenge is that it's happening really, really fast. So for example, I think, the Agri also has 18 months. We have 12 months for the blueprint. It's sort of a high pressure environment in that sense. And in that such, it's the Data Space Support Center is there to help harmonize development, but they also launch at the same time like we did. So for this reason, it's very important that the people who are working in this ecosystem, that they remain connected and that they are open to working ahead in a harmonized manner, that we don't go adopting different solutions, like that we don't differ by like really, really significantly from each other. You are muted.
Thank you, Sophie. I will probably ask the same question to the other three colleagues. And let's go for Iker, because you are working in the actual implementation of data spaces, and you have the experience of that. What is the perception that you are having when you are designing this data space approach? It is in the MVP, MVP, MVDS, and MVG. There is a lot of MVs now, right? And or it is in the scalability, as we mentioned before. How do you see it?
Yeah, the thing is, I also agree with Sophie, right? So there's a lot of initiatives going on around in Europe, right, about implementing data spaces. We have GaiaX, we have IWARE, for example, as well. We have International Data Space. So there's a lot of technologies moving towards data space, but there needs to be a common ground, right? And I think the Data Support Center is doing a good job in that part, in launching this initiative. Recently, about a month and a half ago, I was participating in a session with the International Data Space Association. They are already looking for ways to start collaborating together, right, with GaiaX, International Data Space Association, into figuring like a common vocabulary to talk to all of us who are implementing this technology. Because at the end, the idea is for all of these data spaces at the end to be interoperable, right? Because data space inside of a data space should be interoperable, but again, outside of the data space should also be interoperable. So main idea of the European Union is also this, right? So to have a federated data space around Europe that can talk to each other, that are common in that sense.
Yeah, I perceive that probably all the initiatives are looking for the interoperability, but eventually this interoperability has to be gotten with one unique approach, or with a federated approach, which is the road forward that you perceived here. Because otherwise, yes, we will be probably willing to have this interoperable approach, but which are the steps that we can do in order to facilitate that this is happening And if we take some technical decisions, this will not penalize the posterior interoperability. And I'm thinking now, for instance, in previous technological, let's say, standardization wars that we had, for instance, for videotapes or for the laser disc or other situations in which eventually that gave place to a market confrontation, let's say. Do you perceive that this could be the case, or this is a completely different scenario?
So at the end, in Q1, for example, now that you're talking about this, in a way, how we can proceed into making this interoperable, there's one thing, for example, in the International Data Space Association, they're working already in a new connector. I think this interoperability should be looking at the connectors part, because at the end, that's the part that it's talking and it's the part that is sharing information, is the access point to all of the data sets from data providers, data consumers, application providers, and so on and so forth. For example, they are working right now in the Eclipse data space connector, right? And this is built as a framework. Basically, what they're trying to build is a framework that can connect multiple connectors into that framework. So there's some legacy into that build up and so on, but different connectors, for example, in the data space, you have the trusted connector, you have the international data space connector, you have the Eclipse connector. So the idea is to create a framework that can actually connect different types of connectors to talk to each other and share this information. And that would be the way to scale up and the way to achieve this federated ecosystem of data spaces.
So Sophie, without putting too more pressure into your schedule, how do you perceive this interconnection of interconnectivity that we are interconnectivity square, right? That we are looking for. Are we in the right path, or do you perceive any hindering in the space?
Well, I mean, we will see now. I'm hopeful, and I think we all have the mindset that we want. I mean, also this conversation here is that like we all have this mindset, but at the same time, this is also the first time I met Iker and Roberto. So, you know, there is this. We have the mindset, but we also don't even know who is it that we don't know in the ecosystem that we should maintain the dialogue with. So I think it's just it's just very important that we all remain very proactive.
Good. Roberto, how do you perceive this, particularly in the very relevant aspect of data sovereignty, in which you are an expert, that definitely would provide a legitimacy, let's say, starting point for the data building blocks?
Yeah, first of all, I think that talking about standardization, you were mentioning videotapes and these kind of things. I think that's something that's very important, and maybe as Europeans, I think in this case we are all from Europe, everyone should keep into account is something that has happened a lot in the past, that maybe we try to make very sophisticated standardization efforts, and maybe they are sometimes too complex, and we lose the pragmatism that maybe in the other side of the Atlantic they are more pragmatic than us. And the experience is particularly the web. I don't know that maybe some of you have studied studied computer science, the OSI levels of networking, that there were like 7, and then the United States came with just 4, TCP and so on, and it worked, and now everyone are using that. So I think it's very important in the standardization that we keep in mind that there's then people that is going to be using these standards. So keeping it simple, that is very, very important. And the other, more related with sovereignty, I think that it's my experience. I don't know if it's going to go this way or not, but at least my experience, and my gut says that I like that approach, is the use of these blockchain technologies, because they have proved already. For instance, Bitcoin has been around for a long time in terms of technological landscape, and it's a mechanism based for that. It's sovereignty in the sense just for money. That's the first step. So the idea is to just use that lessons also in this particular case, that is sovereignty on data and what can be done with this data, but also without taking out the risks of that. Maybe too much sovereignty is also a problem if you are thinking, for instance, in data commons or situations where you want to force people to share data because there's like an emergency situation and you need the farmers to share all their data of their production because it's an emergency, no, at the European level. So we will have these kind of tensions emerge for sure. Too much sovereignty maybe is also a problem.
So that's really a very interesting topic. I never thought about that. But yes, eventually we are accessing the data. We have to understand to what extent we are able to access it or not, and force this access too. And one question regarding, we were talking, Sophie, about the silo breaking and the need of having these verticals in some way connected, right? In a more straightforward way. How do you perceive now this approach as a do you think that we are still in this context in which we are having this agriculture data space, or eventually health data space, which is associated with one more specific regulatory framework, or law data space, etc.? This interconnection, how do you perceive to happen in the close future? Is it going to be easy to, or is it going to be straightforward to happen, or do you perceive actual hinder? Do we need instruments in order to facilitate this silo breaking?
Yeah, well, the idea is that the Data Space Support Center provides like general building blocks for data spaces that can be adopted to the specific environments. And the idea behind this is that it would ensure that these data spaces would remain interoperable with each other. However, as I said, it's everything is running in parallel. So right now, I would say like everyone has the right attitude and the right ambitions, and the fundings are going that way. And I'm hopeful that this will be achieved. But I can also just repeat that being proactive is essential here, I think, bearing in mind that also I mean, we have different stakeholders here, like what Roberto was mentioning. For example, in agriculture there is a lot of private players. For example, in the data space for smart cities and communities, our end users are the public sector. And innovation happens and it's adopted in a very different way in the public sector from the private sector, because there's a different dynamic behind it. So it's being user-centered or human-centered, and like understanding what are the abilities and capacities.
This is an excellent point, and since DT4REGIONs project itself is focused or targeting in some way this reflection about the public sector, I think that your comment is very valuable. You also mentioned something that I want to extend to the three speakers. You mentioned capacity building, right? And you mentioned also skills development. What do you perceive that we are having in some way? Are we prepared for this change that will imply interconnectivity in a multi-interoperable way, or are we needing some new skills for new job profiles, new professionals in order to develop this? Which are the key skills that you would identify that are needed today in order to unleash this European power for thanks to data, which is probably not, as mentioned in one of the conferences that we attended recently, not only the new oil, but also the new soil in order to see it to grow, right? Sophie, do you have any idea about this? Probably many, right?
Well, I mean, maybe the first job would be for someone to keep track of all the initiatives and just being like the person who is aware of everything that's happening. But I mean, my cynicism aside, probably, I mean, something that everyone's already talking about, and I think it's already happening in a lot of places, is being a data steward. So I think that's definitely an area which is up and coming. So yeah, I would say like a lot of the job will be around the maintenance and sustainability of data.
Okay, there is the same question also shared to Iker. What do you perceive that in the context, do you perceive some missing jobs here or some missing profiles?
I think one of those profiles would be for data governance, right? Someone to keep track of all that part of interoperability, traceability, enforcement of data usage, right? So we are now starting to see how we need to, in a way, automate all of that part of data governance, right, in the data space. We need to change our mindset, right? So one thing that also needs to be fostered in these new jobs is to break that part of creating data that will be stored privately. Now we need to change our mindset. It needs to be, we are creating data that needs to be shared because sharing is what creates that value. And we need to, those new jobs would need to be about how we can keep track and control of that data sharing in a data space, right? So I think data governance and in a more technical aspect would also be a position that most likely will come forward in the future.
Very clear. Roberto, what do you think? What do you think that probably the university or other institutions could do in order to create or to feed these new profiles, identifying a new profile that is missing in order to accelerate or in order to, let's say, make more efficient this transition to the data spaces development?
Yeah, I think universities can help in some cases, also training, and in particular in the agriculture space, based on what we have been discussing with the stakeholders. Here we have very interesting players like the advisors. We have the cooperatives. That is also a very interesting way of aggregating all these farmers. So something that we are also exploring is data cooperatives. So all these farmers can work together, so they don't have to decide individually what they do with the data, but they aggregate the power that emerges from aggregating all this data. And also this figure of the advisors that also usually are common in the cooperatives, that are the ones that are the intermediaries between technology and all these things that emerge that are outside of the scope of the farmers per se. Future farmers will be trained on this for sure, that come from agronomic universities, but the ones that are already in the field will need the help of these kind of players that bring technology to them.
I mean that this is linking also with the need of trust, right? That Sophie was mentioning before. In order to build the trust, in order to build the technology, in order to be the binary, we still need the flesh and bone, right? The interaction in the human being in order to as a note for that trust. And eventually, this is a job profile as well, and something that has to be developed with the right skills. This is a delicate also job because if it fails, all the process fails in some way regarding the governance. So very, very interesting approach. I think that this is something that we can eventually also develop. So we are arriving now at the end of our conversation. So I would like to probably close this meeting. We could speak hours and hours, but probably it's time to go home now. And thank you very much for your patience, for all that have been attending, also for the presenters. I would like to probably close this session. If I ask you, all the three presenters, for instance, which is the most interesting part, right, that we are perceiving in the job? Well, potentially, Sophie, you are having to have in a rush now to close the project in like a couple of months and something like that, right? And you will be super entertained. But if I'm having to ask you, which is the part that creates you more curiosity, or the thing that you really are looking forward to see in order to happen in the following months? And something I say, look, Fernando, probably we should pay attention to this area, because this is an area in which we can have much innovation or special or particular reaction. What would you say?
So, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Sophie. Don't worry.
So basically, I would say for me, like I have short-term and long-term ones. So in the short, like right now, in reality, for me it would be about I think also as a project manager on the job, in this project, my main task is to really reach out and understand what all the data spaces are doing to align. So this goes back to the point that we mentioned already, this effort to harmonize. In the long run, for me, I really look forward to all the opportunities that data spaces promise and seem to offer as well. So I'm very excited about the work that we are doing, and I think it can create great social values.
Thank you. Sophie, Iker, what is your view regarding this?
Yeah, for me, one of the key the things that it really excites me the most about data spaces is that part of sharing and creating a space where companies can put forward data, right? Because the value of any new product that we'll see in the future, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on, will come from crossing data, right? So right now, sometimes it's quite difficult to access data sets, right? So one of the big challenges when you're starting creating models is, what data do I have available, right? So I need to start convincing people of allowing me to access their data. I need to cross this data with this other one, right? So a data space is meant to break those barriers, right? So that's one of the things that excites me the most, and I'm really looking forward to see what new products, new services we will have in the future, because at the end, this would be the base, right? A data space is no more than a tool, right? And a tool to build new products, new services, and we'll see what the future holds. But most likely, this is the base, for example, for AI, right? So it's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to see how it develops in the future, and I'm really happy to be part of this. And
yes, definitely. All those are working now in computer vision, artificial intelligence, are suffering like a tsunami of news every day in the news about the social impact that this can have. And definitely this is a moment very much interesting in which you have to talk also about the responsibility of developing these data spaces and forward. And this is super hot topic, and I'm really looking forward also to know how this is going on, and to how this debate and discussion, and a proper discussion, is driven to society, is brought to society. So, Roberto, probably you can be invited to also close this session with your view in what is the thing that you're expecting to happen, or those things that are providing more curiosity to you in the following months, weeks to come.
Well, I think that that's that breaking point that is okay. Everyone is happy with sharing. It's something that is not happening right now. We experience that every day. If you go to someone and you participate in a project and you ask them for the data, they are quite sure they will not agree at the first, and they will need some talking and convincing and trust, that kind of trust that we were mentioning before. And I think that maybe something that can break that at the end is something that is driving these silos is if we can get to something around data sovereignty, in the sense, okay, I can share the data, I don't lose control on that data. And in fact, by sharing the data and mixing it with others, but without losing the control, so we should keep that in mind, I can build things that were not possible before. So at the end, you are not losing anything because the data is yours still. No one has copied the data. And you have this mechanism that, well, one example will be that the algorithm comes, visits your data, and goes out with the trained model, but just for your data. But then there's this step of aggregation of the models trained with individual data sets and building one big model, really good, really performant, that all the ones that have participated have a portion of that right to use that. I think that will break actually these barriers, and I was completely agree with the previous ideas. No, that will bring artificial intelligence to the next level.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Iker. Sophie, thank you very much. I think that we learned a lot with you today. Thank you for generosity, also for sharing your slides and your data, and for also providing us with a roadmap also to what is going to happen in the years to come. Today, we had the chance to approach to data spaces as an entry point. We had a pointer to the building blocks, and we had a number of examples. Then we had the possibility of discussing relevant points such as data sovereignties, about the types of minimum viable products that we can create, also the potential transformations that in our society could happen. This is very valuable, and this will be only the first step. I wish you all the best and to go on deepening on the documentation that we just shared, and looking forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Have a nice evening. All. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sí, Miriam está todavía con nosotros.